Welcome back to another Sound Truth interview. I'm your host, Adam Miller, and today I'm joined by Neil Shenvi, who is the author of a book called Why Believe? A Reasoned Approach to Christianity. It's a great resource and one that I think is really prevalent within our culture today, as there are a lot of questions as to the necessity for Christianity as a part of our culture in general, but also to have these questions being raised by many of our parents and grandparents who call in and ask about their children and their grandchildren who have gone to secular universities and have rejected the faith that they were raised in. So I know that this is a pressing issue, and it's one that is obviously pressing to our guest today. So, Neil, thank you so much for being a part of the many voices for that one message.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak, Adam.
Why don't you get us started by telling us a little bit about yourself? Because I actually think your background and your story is really going to be interesting to a lot of our listeners who are struggling with this question. So you did not grow up in a Christian home. So tell us a little bit about how you came to the faith.
No, I had great parents, but I grew up in a non-Christian home. I went to university at Princeton, and I would have called myself spiritual, but not religious. And I would have probably called myself a Christian, to be honest, because, you know, we live in the U.S. We everyone here is Christian. If you're not a Muslim or you're not, but I had very little knowledge of anything related to Christianity. I thought Jesus was basically a good moral teacher. I hadn't really. I read the Bible just as to say I did. I think when I was like 11, I read it from cover to cover just because I was like, well, I can now say, yes, I've read the Bible. I'm very intelligent. But I was not a believer. But at Princeton, several things happened to sort of pave the way to my eventual acceptance of the gospel. One was that as a freshman, I think, there was a book table in front of my dining hall that was handing out free books, and I got a copy of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. And I loved that book. It was really helpful to me. I met my future wife, Christina, during my senior year, and she was a missionary kid. And so that just meeting her and knowing her really helped me to understand what Christianity was about. And then we actually went out to graduate school at UC Berkeley, and that's where I eventually became a Christian. And I began attending church with her, and I saw very intelligent Christians, professors, academics, postdocs, and I had to take the gospel seriously. So all those three things led me to eventually come to Christ.
What's interesting about it, I think, is the fear that many of our listeners have with their children going off to, I mean, Ivy League schools and to really high academia, that their faith is going to be undermined in some way. And you sort of had this completely different path that led you to faith. So, kind of knowing that concern that our listeners are having, there is a risk, right? There is a challenge when you go to secular school because secularism is not going to be teaching the foundations of our faith.
That's right. And it's worth taking that threat seriously and therefore equipping your kids. Of course, I'm not even saying you have to send your kids off to some secular university, but if you choose to, definitely equip them before they go. There's tons of great resources out there to help solidify their faith, to give them the reasons for knowing that the gospel is true and maintaining their confession throughout the college years. And I think really that you can't escape it in this culture. Keeping your kids within a sort of a Christian context and a Christian environment, it's not a guarantee that they're not going to encounter these obstacles. So I'd say everybody should be equipping their kids to handle these objections to the faith.
Yeah, it's not relegated to the universities anymore. This is pervasive. It's in every culture. It's in the friend groups. It's in online wherever they're at online. So this is something that is actually pretty pervasive, especially with many of the prominent Christian leaders who have deconverted over the past
Mhm.
several years. This is something that has been an influence in their life from very early on. So this is a real question that every parent needs to be aware of, but also that teenagers need to be able to build a foundation, understand. As you did, you evaluated these questions and concerns and took them seriously because you had a whole community of people that were taking it seriously.
Right. And I think one of the things that my book aims to do is to show that Christianity is intellectually credible. I wanted to write a book that not only could students read it, high school students, college students, people outside of the university, but I wanted to write a book that they could hand to their professors,
Mm.
and they'd feel comfortable giving this book to people at the highest levels of scholarship. And it has footnotes in it. it interacts heavily with prominent non-Christian and atheist secular scholars in the sciences, in biblical studies, and so it's clear that I try to do my homework. So again, if you hand it to someone who's a very prominent scholar, they're not going to read it and say this is just simplistic. It's written at an eighth grade level. I want it to be accessible and yet to have some kind of intellectual heft. So again, that was my goal, and I think it seems to come across that way. People that have read it have said it. You can tell that you're a scientist by training. It's very systematic, very logical, very evidence focused.
Mm. I think that you and I had completely different track records. I grew up in a Christian faith. I grew up in the church, and I kind of adapted a lot of those propaganda type messages that were very
Mhm.
winsome and crafty, but within a closed circle. So a lot of my early arguments for the faith were very not critical thinking. They were
Mhm.
very inclusive to our group and kind of insular in that way. So we have completely different kind of paths to the same point. But I think you're absolutely right, where critical thinking is so important because now I think young people that are searching for the truth are very much scrutinizing to a high degree what is being said.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important for parents to inoculate their students against the best secular arguments. Gone are the days when you can just hope that your kids won't encounter. It'll keep them sheltered. They're not going to be exposed to these sort of pathogens. Well, that's gone. The internet has dissolved all of that, even the ability, even in theory, to keep your home totally protected from the quote unquote worldly outside influences. That's not going to, that never was really the case, but today especially, it's impossible. And so it's important for parents not to just give their kids superficial answers. You do not want them to first encounter arguments for the fabrication of the gospel stories. It's all myth. It's all a legend. You don't want them to first encounter that as a freshman in college. That is is a recipe for disaster. You want them to have heard that claim, in seventh, eighth grade, ninth grade, and then be able to answer that. If they get bowled over if the first time they've ever even heard of that objection is when they're in Religion 101.
Mm. We are living in a culture where we're seeing a huge rise of children who grew up in the church walking away from their faith. And there have been a lot of studies that found that it actually happens far earlier than university, where
Mhm.
teenagers and even middle schoolers are developing these arguments. They're hearing them amongst their friends, they're in the public school system, whatever is the cause, their rejection of the faith starts much, much earlier. Do you have a kind of a bead on parents where this is something that we've often overlooked. This is obviously something we've been naive about, thinking that it's just their adult years that we have to worry about. This
Mhm.
happens a lot earlier in most cases.
Right. And I actually have an acquaintance online who taught middle school at a Christian school. And he said, as a fifth grade teacher, he would have a box that people could just submit anonymous questions. They'd drop it into the box, and his students could ask him questions about anything. And in fifth grade, he did that and answered a lot of good questions. He's an apologist. But then he said he moved the next year. He was teaching sixth grade. And by sixth grade, the box was always empty because the kids were too afraid to ask their questions.
Mm.
And so I just taught a camp for on apologetics, a boot camp, 3 days, like 5 hours a day, to teenagers, ages like I think 12 through 18, about all of these arguments. The same material is in my book. And at the end of the camp, we had Q&A, and I was gratified that they asked a lot of good questions. But some of them were actually pretty basic theological questions. And these are kids that have very committed Christian parents that are going to church, they're in youth group. They still have a lot of questions, and thank goodness they were willing to ask them. But it reinforced my conviction that we need to have space and a forum where kids can ask what they might think are dumb questions, and it's completely judgment free. We're here to answer your questions and not to give you flippant answers, and not to say, how can you not know that? Just say, no, we want to help convince you that this is a credible faith that can withstand scrutiny.
I want to touch on that. I realize it's a little bit outside of the realm of your book, but I think it's still pertinent to the book in the sense that I do believe, as you were mentioning, that these kids are curious. They have questions. They want to know. But getting them to elicit those questions and actually talk about these things can be actually pretty hard. We can't just allow them to happen organically in the spontaneous moment. You actually have to do a little bit of digging. You actually have to probe yourself as a parent, a grandparent, a youth leader, a pastor. You have to be able to actually tap into those questions and do a lot of the digging yourself.
And sometimes I think it is just a change in venue. So maybe with their parents, even though you've made yourself very available and open, they might just feel uncomfortable asking you.
Mm.
But if they're in an environment where they're, in my class, it was 100 students and then me. So they outnumbered me.
Yeah.
But I think maybe it was less threatening because they felt like, well, I'm surrounded by other kids and it's less of an awkward thing that, like, well, if it's one-on-one, they're going to quiz me and but no, it's an environment where I feel safe asking questions. Also, I'm not gonna. They don't know me. I'm not gonna report to their parents and say, "You know what your kid asked?" No, it's totally a non-threatening environment. They feel like after 3 days, I'm knowledgeable. I can probably answer their questions, having had some with some thought behind it. So yeah, I'd encourage parents to not don't let yourself be the only people who are there for your kids. Have youth leaders, have other parents, your friends, adult friends who your kids feel comfortable talking to about those questions.
Mm. I would say this is kind of a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, but one of the other elements I think that can be considered in this environment is to divide the sexes, to get the boys with just
Mm,
the boys and the girls with just the boys, because you or the girls with just the girls. You eliminate a lot of those distractions, a lot of those kind of relational things that are kind of a big component to girls not wanting to sound like they're trying to be smarter than they actually are, and guys really just not trying to be funny just to impress the girls. So I
mm,
think sometimes, and again, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's really important, especially for a lot of parents who want to be able to help their kids. I think that there's a drive now. There's a lot of books been written on apologetics recently, and I love yours. But I think that there's a market for it now because parents are really concerned at what the world is that their kids are forging.
mm. And I think, like I said, I think this book it is written. It's accessible to motivated high school students. So, like my son could read it. The material I gave in this class, ages 12 plus, it was the same material. But I do think you're like, well, I don't know if my kid could handle it. Yeah, but you could, hopefully. So, it's a book that would equip you as a parent to have answers. And if your kid asks you a question, you say, "Oh, that's chapter 3," and so you could just turn to my book, for example, and you'll see, there's tons of footnotes. And you'll say, well, he answers it here, but then he gives, 3 other books that are just on this topic exclusively. So it's a resource in that way also.
Yeah, parents and grandparents might be intimidated by the idea of apologetics, but they ought to be more intimidated by the results of not being able to provide honest answers that are
Hmm.
thought out to the next generation.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about how you structured the book here and how it's laid out. Tell us a little bit about the arguments that you've kind of factored into this book as that are present really within the environment we're living in today.
Sure. So it's structured around 4 arguments for the truth of Christianity, and that was important to me. I didn't want to simply convince people that some kind of God existed. I wanted to say, no, Christianity in particular is true. It's the biblical God. So the 4 arguments that sort of frame the book are the trilemma. That's C.S. Lewis's argument that Jesus was either Lord, liar, or lunatic. We have to make a choice about him. The second argument is the resurrection, that Jesus actually is historical evidence that Jesus rose physically from the dead. The third section is on God and revelation. So those are the sort of standard arguments for how do we know that God exists, but they're presented within a framework of the Christian God. It's not just a vague God, it's the God who's revealed himself in Scripture. And then the final section is about the argument from the gospel. So I make the claim that the gospel itself is the best evidence that Christianity is objectively true, which is an unusual, I think it's a pretty new argument. And so I argue that, believe it or not, you actually have the best reason to believe that Christianity is true already in your life. Just the gospel, this message that Jesus died for your sins and rose from the dead. That narrative explains things at a deep existential level, like you're aware of certain things, a story of your own life and of reality that makes everything come into focus. And so basically, I'm arguing that that central message of the gospel explains reality in a way that other religious stories and other religious traditions just don't. And so that's actually can give us great confidence that Christianity is actually true. So those are the four main arguments that I advance, and they're all independent, although they build on one another. So obviously they work together. So Jesus made these claims about his divinity, and he claimed to be the Messiah, and then he also rose from the dead, and it fits into this overarching biblical narrative about the fall and redemption. And then we're presented with this message that speaks to our hearts that we're sinners who need a savior. All of those four things go together to make an extremely strong case that Christianity is true. It's showing that Christianity is true.
Mm. What's interesting is your story, your testimony sort of kind of applies to the first argument really quite well. Obviously, you're quoting C.S. Lewis, who you said was
Mhm,
instrumental in you coming to the faith, but also your ability to call yourself a Christian in some way because you were culturally an American and not Muslim or Buddhist
mhm,
or whatever, but you identified as a Christian and yet still had major objections without knowing who Christ claimed to be. So that's a pretty
mhm.
unique kind of a track to come into this argument because you were on the side of someone who claimed in some way to be a Christian and yet had never really evaluated the claims of Christ.
Right, and I would have probably just said, when I think back, I probably would have said I believed in God. But when I met my future wife, Christina, who was a Christian, that's when I realized I'm not a Christian. When I realized, wait a minute, the way that she's talking about Christianity makes me realize that I don't think about God that way at all.
Mhm.
So it's actually she was really the first person that I think I ever met who was a truly a Christian, a believing, living it out Christian. And so that encounter was important for me because it made me for the first time say, I can't just pick I can't just build a god. I can't like build a bear. Like I go in and just make my own god up and make my own religion up and call it Christianity. Christianity is a real thing, a religion with a set of beliefs that you have to subscribe to, and I don't. And so I think that's actually getting me to stop identifying as a Christian was an important part of me eventually becoming a Christian. It's not just a default cultural thing.
Mm. That's really important, and I think it's really important for our parents and grandparents to hear about why you had to come to that realization, because I think they're putting a lot of stock in the fact that their kids claim to be Christians, even
Mhm,
though they don't actually believe the claims of Christ, nor are they living in a manner that is consistent with following Christ. Those
mhm,
two things that you just mentioned, it's very easy to call yourself a Christian without ever actually looking at Jesus and seeing his claims about himself.
mhm. And I think that essential, and this is why the last part of the book is so important about the gospel being evidence for Christianity. One of the things that apologetics books in general, and apologists can do, unfortunately, is to make it all intellectual. It's all about showing you evidence, good evidence that Christianity is true, but then leaving out the most important part, which is that it calls forth a response. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, well, that means that this narrative of creation, fall, redemption is true, which means that you have to respond to that. You can either reject it and say, no, I'm not a sinner. I do not need a rescuer. Or you have to embrace it at the deepest possible level. And so that final section is, and it includes the last part of the book is about, well, how do you respond then? This is what Jesus has done objectively. Are you going to continue to reject him, or are you going to embrace him? There's no other way. There's no third option. And C.S. Lewis said this too. You can either fall at his feet and call him Lord and Savior, or you can spit at him and call him a demon, or dismiss him as a lunatic. But you can't just pat him on the head and say he's a good moral teacher anymore. So my goal was in the over the course of the book, at the end of it is to bring it back and say, now you're faced with a choice. Are you going to recognize your need and surrender to him, or continue in your rebellion? And so it is my hope, of course, that people read it and become Christians. That's my goal, and that Christians who do read it are then strengthened in their faith.
Mm. You talk a little bit about the moral argument here. That seems to be one that has, I mean, that's one that I grew up with, hearing this
Mhm.
moral argument for why God existed. So explain to us a little bit about what you mean by that and why you approached that in the book.
So the moral argument's another one that I think is important because it speaks to us at a very deep, like an existential level. So, for example, you can embrace these arguments for uh, the existence of a first cause. Well, the universe is here; it wasn't eternal, so it must have come from somewhere. Where did it come from? It came from a creator. You can embrace that argument, and it doesn't really affect your life very much. It's like, okay, I can believe in some just distant spirit who created the universe and kind of left us alone, doesn't care what we do. Well, yeah, that's right. It doesn't affect anything my day-to-day life. But the moral argument speaks to questions of right and wrong, good and evil, and choices we make every single minute of the day. How are you going to live your life? Are you going to do what you know is right and good, or are you going to do what's selfish and evil? And so the moral argument basically says if God doesn't exist, then morality, moral categories, right and wrong, good and evil, don't objectively exist. They don't. But they do exist. We all know it. And therefore, God must exist. He must be the source of those objective moral values and duties, things that you ought to do, ways you ought to live. This was C.S. Lewis's argument in Mere Christianity, and it goes back a long time. But I think, one of the things I do in my book that's maybe somewhat unique is and this I do throughout the book. I give the argument, but then I immediately go into here are the 5 objections you're going to hear to this argument. So the atheist could say this, they could say this, they could say this, and then I respond to those objections. And sometimes I even respond to those responses. And so I go through these iterative rounds of saying, not just here's the argument, but what's not just what's a response, but what is the very best atheist response? Or what's those the 5 best responses? Because again, I don't want them to go into the public square with this, what they think is this awesome argument, and then hear a rebuttal they've never heard, get blown away. Like, wait a minute, you didn't prepare me for this. So I want to prepare them as best as I can to answer, not just give the reasons, but then give them reasons to respond to the objections.
And that takes a lot of work, but it's also admirable. I love the way you written this book because addressing those requires you to be intellectually honest. You can't
Mm.
create these ad hominems and create these fake figures to attack. You really have to bring about an argument that will stand within the culture that we're living. I'm curious because we're living in a culture right now, as you talk about the moral argument, we have to have a definer of morality in order to have any moral standards. But we're living in a culture where that seems to be changing every single day. I mean, you just have to watch the news and realize that all of a sudden the terms and definitions of right and wrong are completely off the map. So we're living in a unique culture. How does that moral argument offer answers to the culture that we're currently in?
One of the things I think I actually heard it a long time ago from Mark Dever, who's a pastor in Washington D.C., but he said that we need to be confident that God's written His law on our hearts. We all have consciences. We do. We suppress them. That's true. Paul says that too in Romans 1. But they're there, and so we don't have to say, "Well, man, what if people deny that morality exists?" They will. They will do that. Of course, they'll say, "No, I don't believe in right and wrong, good and evil. These are all just social constructs." They'll say that with their mouths, but we know that's not true. We know that they encounter the same moral reality that all of us do because we're made in God's image. And so we have to start from that assumption, that truth that no, those categories are really out there and we all encounter them. And that what they're doing, like all of us, is suppressing that truth in unrighteousness. And again, not just singling out atheists. We human beings naturally all do that until we're converted. And uh, so in the book, I respond intellectually to those objections, but I also point out that even the avowed moral relativist who will say, "I don't believe in good and evil and right and wrong," their actual behavior does not reflect that. There's an inconsistency when they because you'll say people will say, "Well, I don't believe in right and wrong and good and evil. These are all social constructs, and this is bigotry. This is evil, wicked hatred, and how can you do that?" Well, wait a minute, wait a minute. Maybe I'm just living my truth as a bigot. But so there are many cases, and I show them in the book, where you'll catch people invoking moral categories even after denying them intellectually. And I'll say, wait, what's going on? The answer is they're running into the same categories that all of us have as human beings made in God's image. And I actually quote from an atheist author named Steven Pinker. He's a Harvard psychologist, wrote a great book called The Blank Slate, where he, in his appendix, points out that categories of right and wrong and good and evil are human universals. Just from an anthropological perspective, all human cultures realize there is a moral law. Now, they differ as to what the content is, although they're wide agreement on things like you shouldn't rape, you shouldn't murder. But the point is, that's the human experience. We know there are things that are right and wrong. And we may not have room for that in our worldview, but that just means our worldview is wrong. And as Christians, we should say, well, no, we have the right worldview, and it explains your experience properly.
Mm. I was growing up in the Christian church years ago, always hearing these warning signs. We're going towards Sodom and Gomorrah. We're leading to a state where the world has completely rejected God. And I would just roll my eyes because I would all admit now I was pretty naive back then, to see how truth had been undermined so much, even just decades ago, to now be in a place where the standard for truth is constantly being changed and ripped out from underneath us. It's a lot harder to fight for those moral arguments and those truth claims when people are constantly being shifted on unsolid ground. And we really are living in a time where ultimately the devil's attack is to attack any foundation for truth.
Mhm. But again, I would say I think Christians can then be reactive and defensive and try to make the case that no, no, really, really, some things are right and wrong. But I would just say take a deep breath and realize that they're at war with reality. That then they, at a deep level, they know that these truths are there, these moral truths are there, and they're suppressing it. But it takes, in some sense, effort on their part. They're living in a way that's at variance with reality. I think Francis Schaeffer said that reality is what you bump into when you're wrong.
Mm,
And we're seeing more and more people bumping in hard into realities. And sooner or later, they're going to, well, hopefully, they'll wake up and say, something's wrong with my worldview because this isn't making sense. And that's why I think Christians, even if in the moment when you present, say, the moral argument, you say there's certain things that are good and evil, right and wrong, they reject it. But you've hopefully put a stone in their shoe. And they're going to say, when a year, 2 years, 10 years later, when something starts falling apart, they're like, maybe something, they'll go trace it back and say, maybe my problem was denying what I knew to be true.
mm,
And so again, I think that we should not, we don't have to be quite so defensive. We can say, I am standing confident in what is true and what God has revealed, and then operating and arguing from that position, that this is why we actually already know that God exists, even though, again, our natural inclination is to suppress that knowledge because why? Because we all know we're on the wrong side of God's law. If we thought we were awesome, I think we'd be totally willing to say, yeah, yeah, there is a moral law and I obey it. This is great. But because we're sinners, that's why we suppress the truth, because we know we're on the wrong side of not of history, of God's law. And so that's why we tend to we it's like the person is like the there's a funny story about a guy who's, the engine light is on his car, like the blinking, it's flashing red, blinking, check engine, check engine. So he gets a piece of electrical tape and just tapes over it, just black, can't see it anymore. Well, he is the problem gone away? No, but he has suppressed the problem because he can't see it. So we are doing that as a culture and as individuals. We tape over the check engine light. It doesn't make the problem go away, but it makes us bother us less until the car breaks down.
mm. I absolutely love that answer and that illustration because it's absolutely right. There's a concern and there's a fear that our world is going towards darkness and going away from God, but there are natural consequences for that end up resetting itself, right? It ends up getting to a place where shame and consequences and actions cause people to turn from their wickedness and turn to Christ, or as the societies as a whole collapse underneath this world philosophies. I have a lot of pastor friends who are really concerned where the church is going to be 20 years from now with all of the things that are happening in our world. And I said, we're just going to have to stand and keep preaching the truths, verse by verse, passage by passage, and just accept the fact that the world eventually is going to either go their own way or come back to these truths. But we can't change the truths in order to keep up with the sort of trajectory that the world is going in.
And it would be unloving to try to change the truth for the sake of popularity, because one thing that it's interesting in think of Acts 17 when Paul enters Athens and sees the city so full of idols. It says he was deeply distressed or moved or troubled in the spirit. And I think it's ambiguous, like, because it's he's angry but also saddened by what he sees. And I think that's a great mixture of emotions, because we should be angered by evil in the culture. We should also be deeply heartbroken, both, because when people break God's law and people ignore reality, they're breaking themselves. We were made to obey God's law. We were made to live a righteous life. And when we don't do that, when we reject that, yes, we incur God's wrath. We also, in His judgment, we also ruin ourselves. And so we can look with not just frustration and anger, but also with compassion and say these people are ruining their lives. And also just like I ruined mine. What are you? Are you righteous? No, I'm also a sinner. I also do these same things, disobeying God's law and breaking my own life. And so, how much more than should I have compassion on people who are just like me apart from God's grace?
Mm. For any of our listeners who are asking the question, why believe? Why this book? Apologetics is hard. I've got a lot of other problems I got to deal with. Is this really that big of an issue? My kids aren't asking the questions. My grandkids aren't raising those concerns. Is this really a book for them?
I would say they aren't asking them yet.
Mm.
That yet is that's for the I mean, if they never do, if you're one of the 1% of families that their kids just never ever question these things, well, that's great. I mean, and that's true. Seriously, that's wonderful. But I think the vast majority of kids will ask these questions at some point, and you want to have prepared them. And so, yeah, if you don't want to buy my book, that's completely fine. There are tons of great books out there on these topics, but definitely, please, I'm begging you to equip these kids. It's not just Neil Shenvi talking. There's a biblical imperative to be prepared. Be prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have in us. It's 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. And so it takes preparation. It's not something that just do it. No, it takes preparation. It takes investment. And what's more valuable a way to spend your time than to equip yourself and your kids to defend the gospel, and also just to give yourself confidence that no, this stuff is really true. I mean, it's amazing when you look at the Bible through a apologetic lens. There are plenty of passages where Paul, like in Luke chapter 1 verses 1 through 4, Luke's purpose in writing the gospel of Luke, and then in Acts and Theophilus, his purpose is to give Christians certainty about the things they've believed. He's saying, yeah, you've believed these things, but look, no, they're really truly true, and here's why. Here's how you can know that. So there's tons of um, uh, biblical imperatives saying we need to be prepared to answer questions. We need to know the truth and be prepared to defend it. And so just definitely do that as a family.
Of course, you would quote Luke, Dr. Shenvi, right?
Yeah.
You would go to someone who is an academic creating those arguments. But for any of our listeners who are already in the place where their children have rejected the faith, they're already raised these arguments, they've already bought hook, line, and sinker
Mhm.
these arguments against the faith. And then as parents and grandparents who are saying it's too late, I've already lost that bridge. It's already burnt down. What would you say to them?
One thing I would do, when this is a great advice across the board, is that I often find people are more receptive to having conversations or doing anything if it's a mutual. So I actually first got involved in apologetics by interacting with an atheist on his blog. What we did was he first recommended a book for me to read, and I read an atheist book, and then I recommended a book for him to read. And then I don't think he ever read it, but I read his. The point is, oftentimes in these situations, rather than just saying, here's a book, read it, why don't you say, hey, I'd like to understand your views better. Can you give me the best book that you know of that will articulate your views? And then I'll read it along with you. And then maybe that'll open them up to even maybe not even open to saying reading your book, but maybe if you do that, then you can say, now next, can we read this book together? So it's very non-threatening because you're offering, well, no, give me the things you want me to read and I'll read them, and then I'll read, and you can maybe read the book that I'm recommending and do it together, and you can talk about it over coffee, whatever. But I think it's a very non-threatening way, especially that offer to, well, help me understand your position. I actually met a guy who's a Mormon a few months ago, and I said he found out I was an apologist, and we talked about the gospel and the difference between Christianity and Mormonism. But then rather than saying, well, just read my book, I said, well, actually, I have studied Mormonism a little bit, but I'd love to know more. Can you give me the best book defending Mormonism? And he ended up moving. But the point is, that was a very all I'm asking him so that I can read it from and truly for my benefit, because I want to know more about Mormonism, not because I think it's true, but because that helps me to engage Mormons. So in the same way, that might be a great way for you to engage your non-Christian children, grandchildren, etc.
Mm, that's great advice, and something I've implemented myself. Allowing somebody to articulate their own point of view and then to talk to them allows them to have the definition of their point of view so that you can address it, as opposed to attacking a straw man and
Mhm.
characterizing them a certain way and then not even hitting the mark. It's very, very helpful to allow that conversation to flow. But to our listeners, you should probably read this book before you pass it on, because you need to be challenged to understand the arguments as well. So get a copy of Why Believe by Neil Shenvi. Neil, with that being said, could I ask you to pray for our listeners and pray an encouragement over them as we are navigating some really strange times in the culture that we're living right now? A lot of questions, and to know the answers. The Bible gives us ultimately the hope and the spirit to understanding. So would you pray for our listeners to that end?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time with Adam. I pray for all the people hearing this that they would be encouraged to know that the gospel is true, that Jesus, you're worthy of our confidence, and that you are in control of everything. And if people have children or grandchildren who have strayed from the faith and abandoned it, I pray that you would call them back. We just take comfort in the fact that you're our shepherd and we're sheep, and the good shepherd seeks after those that are lost. So we pray for all those kids who I think people are praying for, that you would bring them back. And I pray that we would be equipped, that we would take the time, invest in learning how to defend the faith with reason and evidence. But more than anything, Lord, that we'd simply invest in our relationship with you, that we would um, take the time to pray and to read the Bible and obey your commands, because this is just one of your many commands to us. And Lord, your commands are good, and they're for your glory and our benefit. So Lord, I pray that we would be one part of our discipleship. Thank you so much for rescuing us. We know that we fall short every single day, and we depend on your grace. So bless us and bless your word in your name. Amen.
Amen. We've been talking with Neil Shenvi about his book, Why Believe? A Reasoned Approach to Christianity, a great resource, one I can highly recommend to you to get a copy of yourself. So let us know by giving us a call, 508-362-7070. And Neil, I can't thank you enough. I love not just your books, but also your content online. If anyone wants to find out more information about you, where should they go?
You can just Google Neil Shenvi. I think I'm the only Neil Shenvi in the world right now. So it's Neilshenvi, and I'm on Twitter too much, but you can follow me on Twitter to keep abreast of what I'm reading and writing about these days. But yeah, the best way is I know I have a website too. You'll find my website, and I have all my contact information there. So yeah, just Google me.
I don't think I ever type in an actual web address anymore. Everything just goes right through Google or whatever search
Yeah.
you're using, and it's always it's easy enough to just click on the link. But we've been talking with Neil Shenvi. His book is called "Why Believe." You can find out more information again on the book by heading to our website at songtime.com. So Neil, thank you so much for being a part of the many voices for that one message.
Thank you, Adam.